Yes, to show you the film. So one is that the idea of environmental human rights began with Rachel Carson at the end of her life when she was dying of breast cancer, and gave in her last speeches before Congress and before the Women's Press Club her vision of environmental human rights. And then that's something that I took up 3 decades later, and that's what I continue to work with. And here we are in upstate New York, surrounded by land leased to the gas industry, and the human rights movement is blossoming right here, and we're all now part of it. It's this amazing moment in history. I mean, this night, this month, things that are about to unfold are things that you'll tell your own children and grandchildren about, just as those who lived in the civil rights movement were able to say, you know, we marched with Martin Luther King Jr. And so it's an amazing time to be part of this. Also, I wanted to let you know that the film itself has kind of finished its film festival run and theater run, although it will be shown in Telluride and at the end of May, which is nice for it. It's now being made available as a DVD for citizen groups and for colleges to use it in their own community organizing and to play their role in the environmental human rights movement. So the filmmaker and I have just finished completing the guidebooks that go along with that. There's one for educators that have sample assignments and how to lead a class discussion using parts of the film. There's one for community groups and so forth. And so anyone who's interested, let me know because we're just beginning now to launch it as a DVD, and then it can really move into the grassroots, and we hope kind of catalyze the environmental human rights movement. All right, so that's by way of introduction to me, and tonight I would want to talk to you very joyfully about my new book, Raising Elijah, the title of which is intended to refer to an historical figure, Elijah Lovejoy, the abolitionist from my home state, who lived in 1830, and maybe he's not as familiar to you as somebody like Harriet Tubman. But Harriet Tubman is to New York what Elijah Lovejoy is to Illinois, which is my home state. So Elijah Lovejoy was an abolitionist in the 1830s who was very fearsome in his insistence that slavery was a homicidal abomination and simply needed to end, and needed to end immediately. At a time when almost nobody was saying that, and those kinds of words were really incendiary. It was a time in our nation's history when the economy was entirely dependent on slave labor. It made the cost of goods low. It made us competitive in the world marketplace. And the argument was made, and perhaps rightfully, that we would have a hard time feeding ourselves if we didn't have all this unpaid slave labor. And so it was also a time when there was plenty of awareness at the grievous horrors of slavery, so much so that it was not legal anymore to bring new slaves over from Africa. So the slave trade had ended. But that only meant that the pre-existing slaves were now individually worth lots more money, so they were accruing in value, right? Because you couldn't ship any more over. And so people then who were slave owners in the slave-owned parts of the nation were investing in slavery as a form of personal wealth. And so you had, instead of diversifying your portfolio, dumping it into slaves was like investing in real estate in the 1990s. It was considered a really good investment. So suddenly just the pure amount of wealth found up in slave labor was enormous. So in 1830, to say those words and call for immediate abolition was more radical an idea than it was even 100 years earlier, or certainly 100 years later, right? So it was a height of things. And even in a free state like Illinois, which we're all land of Lincolnish and everything else, and we're very proud of our abolitionist history, but the truth of it is in 1830 that everyone knew that we benefited indirectly from all the slave labor just across the river in the Mississippi. And so most people were not calling for the abolition of slavery. They were calling for the regulation of slavery. So we were going to, the big decision was, is Kansas going to be, slave or free or half slave or half free, and what were the policies going to be on runaway slaves, and did they have to be returned, and so forth. And so there was a lot of attempt to sort of kind of manage and control slavery, but to call for its outright abolition was, well, it was so far out there and it's considered so impractical and so unrealistic that Elijah Lovejoy was assassinated in the free state of Illinois, not far from where I grew up, by a pro-slavery mob, not from a slave state, but homegrown terrorists, burst into his, he was an editor and a Presbyterian minister, so they burst into his warehouse where he had a printing press, pumped him full of 5 bullets and dumped his printing press into the river. Now, his brother was best friends with the president of Illinois College, whose sister was Harriet Beecher Stowe, who then went on to write Uncle Tom's Cabin as a kind of direct response to the assassination of this man who everyone revered. And they thought he should have been more quiet, maybe he should have called for the gradual phase out of slavery. They wished he weren't so open about it, but nevertheless, when he was actually dead, his brother started the Underground Railroad running right through Illinois, and as did his best friend, the president of Illinois College, who then his own house became the safe house in the Underground Railroad. And then Harriet Beecher Stowe, part of this whole circle, of course, went on to write the book that many people felt was the silent spring of her generation. It just opened people's eyes to the horrors of slavery. And of course, the young Abraham Lincoln was a young politician in Illinois at the time, and he was deeply moved also by the death of Elijah Lovejoy. So that is a historical story. That's the basis for raising Elijah. Because my idea is that we should raise up the spirit of Elijah Lovejoy for the big human rights crisis of our generation, which I think, from my point of view, is a ruinous dependency on fossil fuel. So I see a lot of parallels between our situation now and where we were in 1830, in that we now have become completely dependent on coal, oil, and natural gas to do things that perhaps slaves used to do. And our economy has become ruinously dependent on them. It's distorting our foreign policy, and it's the basis for our materials economy, for our food chain, for our energy system, and so forth, to the point where many people have failed to be able to imagine life without them at all. So calling for their abolition is a little bit like calling for the abolition of slavery. I mean, it's not imaginable to us in the way that in 1830, living without slave labor was just considered just absolutely beyond the pale of an idea. But I like the comparison because I think it makes us begin to glimpse that we could get to some future that doesn't depend on blasting hydrocarbons out of the earth and lighting up a fire to get things done. And so that our descendants may look back on us now, and the way we look back on the slaveholders of the 1830s, thinking, how is it not possible? Turn the sound up. Okay.
Can you hear in the back?
Yes. The hearing is okay? Yes. Okay, well, there are different ages of people here. How about the people who has at least as much gray hair as I am? Is it all right? Can you hear? Okay, so I'll work on projecting. Okay. All right, so it's a bold idea, raising up the spirit of Elijah Lovejoy. What would it look like to be a fossil fuel abolitionist? Is it even possible? And I think it is, and as we go, I'll kind of lay out the case for it. But I want to first describe the second meaning of the title, Raising Elijah, which is the literal meaning of raising my own now 10-year-old son, Elijah, at this particular moment in human history. So, like my earlier 2 books, there is a personal story that's woven into the argumentation and the science. And I do that for a couple of reasons. One is that a lot of my readers are not scientists, and their ability to just sit there and read page after page of peer-reviewed scientific literature is not as great as the people who are in my Rolodex, who I rely on as my scientist friends. And so I want the personal story to be a kind of interesting narrative arc with characters and flashbacks, so you get through some of the pharmacokinetics of dioxin just because you want to know what happens to that guy that I introduced in the previous chapter. So there's nothing like a good story to kind of keep you turning the pages, so that's part of my I never could make up my mind whether I was a creative writer or a biologist. I do have these advanced degrees in both. So I guess part of my message to all you young folks out there is that if you never make up your mind what to do with your life, at some point you get old enough, people stop asking you. So I really never figured it out. And everyone thinks I somehow planned all this now. So, but I didn't. I just liked biology and I liked English, and I kept not making up my mind, and here I am. So the story serves that function, but it also serves, I think, as a kind of bearing witness to this particular moment in history that we're in. And I would argue that parenting now is different than it ever has been. For example, Elijah, when he was 4, asked if he could be a polar bear for Halloween. And so I went to work sewing him, as many generation of mothers before me have done, sewing him a polar bear costume. I actually have really good sewing skills from all the dissection and vivisection I did. So I can make a polar bear costume. It's part of my skill set. But while I was sewing this costume, it was with the realization that the costume will probably outlast the species. And to figure out what the ears should look like, the polar bears actually had very small ears, but I couldn't remember exactly where they were placed on the head. I had to go through all my files, which I have in my biology office, of polar bears, and they're all about the upcoming extinction of polar bears and the hermaphrodism of polar bears because of global distillation that brings these organochlorines, which are endocrine disruptors, into the polar regions. And because polar bears are high in the food chain, they siphon up all these toxic chemicals which interfere with their hormones and alter the gonadal structure of polar bears. So I have all of these files and files on polar bears, and so there I am with my 4-year-old, hoping that he can't really read the content of well enough yet, but just so I can get a good picture so we know what the ears look like, right? So it occurs to me that this is a unique situation, and that no mother of any other generation has gone to work making Halloween costumes, wondering when the species is going extinct. And that night, out in my village of Trumansburg, trick-or-treating with my son, what did I see? But a whole neighborhood full of endangered species. There were bats, they're going extinct, right? Bats are in real trouble now. There were monarch butterflies, they're also in trouble. There were penguins, there's Micah the polar bear, and on and on. And so I began to wonder, because children have such an affinity for certain species, right? They want to become them. What will it be like? Because 1 in every 4 mammals is now heading for extinction. Absent any further intervention from us on climate change, 1 in every 4 mammals is going. And then the marine mammals is 1 in 3. And then bumblebees, monarchs, there are all kinds of insects in trouble and so forth. So these are the characters that appear in children's stories. These are the costumes they dress up in. So will children care about them when there are no antecedents, real-life antecedents out there in the world and these animals are gone? Will their costumes hang in the closet without these real creatures out there? And what will that be like? And what other mother of any other generation has had to carry these thoughts around while trick-or-treating, right? So that story is in the book, and other stories that make me feel like that at this moment in history, parenting itself has become a different task. So I began with the idea that the environmental crisis is really first and foremost a parenting crisis. It's a crisis of family life, and there's a lot of kind of family values. It's actually my most conservative book. Because as far as I can see, parenting is really fundamentally all boils down to 2 central tasks. One is to prevent your child from being harmed, and the other is to plan for their future. And the environmental crisis interferes with my ability as a parent to do both. I can't protect my child from harm if the plankton in the oceans are in trouble, because the plankton provide us half of the oxygen we breathe. And the generation of kids of which my kid is a part requires an abiding ecology to carry on for him to have a future and to be safe. So that's where I started, and I can see from the expressions on a lot of their faces, this is a topic full of pain and grief. And so I also knew that in order to keep my readers turning pages rather than putting the book down because they couldn't bear it anymore, it was going to require kind of a narrative strategy to break through that, because being paralyzed with grief and not wanting to connect with this information wasn't going to get us anywhere. And so I began to read in the psychological literature. Turns out psychologists have a name for all this. It's called well-informed futility syndrome. It's a very real thing, and it's useful to know about. And what it means is that if you learn about the details of a problem over which you have no agency, or you feel that you have no ability to change the situation, you feel so horrible that you just don't want to know about it. Because nobody wants to feel futilely well-informed. So you'd rather be not well-informed and not feel futile. So the question is, well, we can't just keep all this a secret, that the plankton are in trouble, 1 in every 4 mammals are going extinct, and so forth. We have to have a public conversation about it, but how can we talk about this if everyone's feeling so cruddy that they just want to turn away and change the subject? So you can decide for yourself as readers whether I've managed that or not, but I decided to just raise the topic right in chapter 2 of well-informed futility as a problem that we're going to have to get over, and just say the name of it and take it from there. And I also try to use actually a lot of comedy in Raising Elijah. Assuming laughter is actually an action. And if you can laugh about something, you're kind of willing to take the next step and maybe engage. And of course, that's risky too, because there's nothing worse than trying to be funny and failing to be funny, right? And so, but happily, parenting is full of all kinds of comedic moments, and so I kind of mine those in order to create a story that hopefully is compelling enough that people will want to read about this, and instead of just wanting to be in denial, they want to be part of what really is a human rights movement. So those are my goals. I want to talk a little bit about the kind of conceptual framework of the book, and then I'll move into some of the more writerly parts of it. So in this book, I really suggest a conceptual framework for thinking about the environmental crisis as a human rights crisis. And I submit that the environmental crisis is really like a tree that has 2 trunks, and they share a common root. And one trunk represents what's happening to our planet through the accumulation of heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere. So if you follow that trunk along, you encounter endpoints, well, some of what we talked about, disappearing species, plankton are in trouble, and then there's dissolving coral reefs and so forth. So let me just talk about the plankton for a minute as my one example of that sort of branch of the tree. So what's happening in the oceans right now is really alarming a lot of us in the ecological community. And it's basically a twofold problem. So, you know, water is such a good absorber of heat that all the excess heat that's being trapped when we use the atmosphere as a waste receptacle for burning hydrocarbons, the 93% of that excess heat is actually trapped by the surface water of the ocean. That's where it goes. And so we're warming the surface of the oceans. And that actually interferes with mixing of cold and warm layers of water. And you might know that all the plankton on the Earth, the biosphere of the Earth, have to float on the surface because they're photosynthetic and they have to absorb light. And if they're, you know, they can't be in the dark abyss down below, so they have to float on the surface. And that's exactly where all the heat is being absorbed. All right. So the fertilizer for plankton comes from fish poop. And only the biologists actually have a name for it. It's called marine snow. And that would sift down into the abyss and actually forms the basis of the food chain for all those deep sea creatures. But some of the upwellings and other currents in the ocean bring the marine snow up to the surface where they fertilize the plankton. So the warming that top layer interferes with that mixing. So there's less fertilizer for the plankton, therefore they don't grow as fast. So I was born in 1959, and between that time and now, 53 years, the plankton stocks have declined by about 40%. So they're about 1 to 2% every year. And that's tricky to measure plankton stocks, and so there's argument in the literature about how to measure them and how big the drop really is. But the drop is real. And then the plankton have another problem too, and that is that the oceans are becoming more acidic. And that's because the carbon dioxide that we're pumping into the atmosphere doesn't just trap heat, it actually gets dissolved in the water itself. And now when that happens, it turns to carbonic acid, which is lowering the pH of the ocean. And it turns out that there are a lot of plankton that either have shells or they're the larval form of species that in their adult incarnation have shells, like barnacles. And so shells are made mostly of calcium carbonate. And we're now on the path with the acidification of the ocean for calcium carbonate to go into solution. So at some pH point, which is one of those unchangeable physical chemical phenomenon, right, that you can't bargain away, you hit a certain pH and this solid calcium carbonate will start dissolving and turn into not solid. And so then that spells the end of anything with the shell. So there go the clams and the barnacles and certain kinds of diatoms and so forth, which are the basis of the whole oceanic food chain, but also make up a lot of the zooplankton that are floating around out there with the phytoplankton, which in turn interfere with the phytoplankton, which depend on the zooplankton and so on. And so that's one of the big serious issues with climate change. All right. The other chunk of the tree represents what's happening to us. This is the tree of crisis now, right? So we got climate change, acidifying oceans, and so forth. The other chunk of the tree is what happens when we accumulate inherently toxic chemical pollutants in our bodies. And if you follow this trunk along, so now I'm talking about things like pesticide residues in your food, air pollutants that might be linked to asthma and so forth. And if you follow that trunk along, then you end up finding increased rates of childhood asthma, increased rates of pediatric cancers, learning disabilities, for example, from exposure to lead and mercury, and then something called testicular dysgenesis syndrome, which is one of the well-described phenomenon, probably the most well-described phenomenon in this field called endocrine disruption, meaning that we know there are certain chemicals that have the ability to interfere with male hormone during prenatal development. One of those chemicals that we have good information on is called phthalates, which are a plasticizer that we use to keep vinyl from cracking. Vinyl PVC plastic is very brittle, and so to make like a vinyl shower curtain, you slather it with this chemical called phthalates. The phthalates in prenatal development actually interfere with testosterone in such a way that it could alter the development of the male reproductive tract at very, very tiny, vanishingly small levels. And so the risk here is that baby boys are born with differently shaped genitalia and are at higher risk of things like undescended testicles and then later on in life testicular cancer. So we actually have quite good data on testicular dysgenesis syndrome. So back to the conceptual idea. So my conceptual idea is that the root of this tree, the climate change on the one hand and then toxic trespass on the other, is basically dependency on fossil fuels. Because when we dig them out of the ground and light them on fire, combustion byproducts, either carbon dioxide or their uncombusted fugitive emissions like methane, become greenhouse gases. And now we've piled up so much greenhouse gases and trapped it in the atmosphere, we're actually threatening to destabilize our whole climate system. Or we can use fossil fuels as feedstock for petrochemicals. And so we use coal and natural gas and oil as a starting point to make pesticides and phthalates and so forth, right? So PVC itself is, in the United States, we make from natural gas. So that's a hard thing, I think, for people to think about, that the PVC credit card in your wallet began as bubbles of methane deep underground. And then we bring them out and we do various things with them to turn them into precursors, and eventually we get things like vinyl acetate, and then finally then put monomers of vinyl chloride together to form polyvinyl chloride. Same thing with synthetic fertilizer. In the weed and feed stores, you have all kinds of fertilizer. And farmers, of course, are going to be, in another month or two, pulling those big white tanks right through the field. That's called anhydrous ammonia. That's all made from natural gas. So 5% of the world's natural gas stocks are actually used to create anhydrous ammonia fertilizer. So that's another petrochemical. And then, of course, coal used to be, and still is, the beginning for some things. We used to make more things out of coal than we do now. But things like mascara, right, is coal tar. And let's see, what else we call PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls. You saw those mentioned in the film. They're now outlawed, but those were first synthesized from coal. So, when we use fossil fuels as feedstocks to make chemicals, we create toxic substances that can tinker with cell signaling pathways, alter gene expression, and sometimes place cells on the pathway to tumor formation. So there are really two kind of interconnected crises. But interestingly enough, they're kind of populated by two somewhat disconnected groups of scientists and activists. So the climate change world is largely occupied by men. The scientists who are the leading spokespeople tend to be men. That includes some of our rock stars like NASA climatologist James Hansen, and closer to home, I would say Bob Howard at Cornell, journalist Bill McGibbon, ecologist Carl Safina, and then Tim DeChristopher, another rock star, student who was arrested and that is now serving time in federal prison for attempting to disrupt fracking operations in southern Utah, and did so because he felt his future was threatened by climate change. So, on the other hand, the world of toxic trespass and the attempt to reform our chemical system so we're not dependent on inherently toxic chemicals, that world and that activism is largely populated by women. And of course, Rachel Carson is the guiding spirit, and then there are people like me, Lois Gibbs, of course, very famous here in New York. In 1979, the year I was diagnosed with cancer, Lois Gibbs was unveiling and revealing the presence of toxic pools of waste that were bubbling up in people's basements in the Love Canal neighborhood near Niagara Falls, and then that became a kind of a national symbol and actually ushered in new national laws about right to know and gave us our Superfund laws and so forth. Lois Gibbs and I are now working together on this New Yorkers Against Fracking campaign. So she lives in Washington, D.C. now to make national policy, but she's lending us her hand here in New York to work on fracking. So in an age of extreme fossil fuel extraction, both crises are getting worse. The global climate change crisis and the toxic trespass crisis. Because essentially we're running out of all the fossil fuels that are easy to get, whether you're talking about coal or oil or natural gas. And so what we're left with is this so-called unconventional energy extraction, which is both more toxic to us and also more carbon intense. So the return on the amount of carbon you have to burn to get the carbon out of the ground, that ratio is not as good as it used to be. And there are essentially 4 forms of extreme energy extraction. And they're all making headlines right now. One of them is mountaintop removal. So I just came from North Carolina last week, and that's, of course, a huge topic down there. And that involves now blowing up mountains to get at the coal inside. So what you're left with is no longer a mountain, but a kind of a mesa. And then the mountaintop itself with all of the, mountains contain a lot of elements that have a rightful place on the periodic chart, but are really toxic. And as long as they're deep inside mountains and we don't mess around with them, they're not going to hurt us. But I'm talking about things like uranium and mercury and lead and arsenic. And so you blow up a mountain and you let all the rubble kind of run into valleys and streams. There are many, many problems for the people who live downstream of in those communities. And now we're actually seeing in mountaintop removal communities excess rates of birth defects among children from some of those toxic exposures. So mountaintop removal is one. Tar sands, of course, is getting lots of attention. And the whole question now, which has become an election year issue of whether or not we're going to build this pipeline that would carry tar from the soil of northern Canada all the way down to Louisiana to be refined into gasoline. So under the boreal forests of northern Canada, in certain places, is soil that is full of a very thick kind of oil. Tar isn't a word that doesn't have specific chemical meaning, but it's that kind of viscosity, right? And so to turn it into gasoline requires that you actually cook it out of the soil and then shovel it into a pipeline and then bring it down to be refined in Louisiana's Gulf Coast. The question is, are we going to do that or are we not? So mountaintop removal, tar sands, and then deep sea oil drilling, right? As in the BP oil spill. So we're going out deeper and deeper into the ocean, drilling, 6 miles down, and then if there's a blowout, then we've seen what happens and the difficulty of how to fix an accident like that. And then finally, the one that we're at the very epicenter of, which is fracking. And fracking, for those of you who kind of feel like you've walked into the middle of the movie, I want to kind of explain it, and some of you I know live and breathe this story, so I'll try to speak to both audiences at the same time. A few years ago, I was one of the people who felt like they were walking into the middle of the movie because I was so busy working on pesticides and agriculture. Like fracking was one more sort of little tornado on my horizon, but I wasn't really that clued into it. And so if that's how you feel, I'm empathic because it's fairly complicated and requires a lot of study to kind of figure it out. So let me try to do that for you. So fracking involves, it's a kind of a quick name for a much longer word. Because fracking means fracturing, but what we popularly mean by fracking here in New York is not fracturing itself, but fracturing combined with something called horizontal drilling. All right? So that means that the drill goes down into a layer of shale and turns sideways and then drills sideways like a mile or so through the shale. Then some explosives are put down the hole to blow up the shale and fracture it. And then and in the shale are little tiny bubbles of gas that we're going to go after. That's what we're trying to get out. Now there's so much lithostatic pressure, as I know now the geologists call it, of the earth pushing down that it just, when you blow it up, those cracks aren't going to stay open. So you have to keep the stone doors ajar to let the gas flow out. And to do that, you have to force sand grains into the cracks. And not just any sand grain, but the Samson of sand grains, which is silica, crystalline silica sand, which is mined in the part of where I come from, along the Illinois River Valley, north of me in Wisconsin. So we mine that sand and we force it down there. And then we have to use tremendous pressure to get it in there. And so it's hydraulic pressure. So you take the water and you mix it with the sand, and then 15,000 pounds per square inch of pressure, which is about like swinging a baseball bat into a windshield. You force that down into the cracks, and they'll now be held open so the gas bubbles can flow out. Except that we're going down a mile and then this way a mile, more or less. The amount of friction is so great that you can't possibly just use water alone. So you have to add all these slickeners and chemicals to the water to reduce the friction, and also to hold the sand grains so they can go around the bend and be carried. So you need gels and slickeners and to make it really gooey. And then finally, all this water that you use, and it takes 4 to 9 million gallons per one frac job, right? So that water tends to be drawn from our surface water, lakes and rivers and streams. And that water has living organisms in it. And when you pump it that far down where it's warm and there's gel, it's going to start to grow. Moreover, there's actually living organisms in the shale itself, so-called deep life organisms, that can also engage in what the industry calls biofouling, which means it will interfere with the way gas flows up the pipe. And so therefore, powerful biocides, essentially pesticides, are employed to kill off both the living organisms in the surface water, as well as the living organisms that inhabit the shale itself. So think about that for a minute, because it's a kind of a new perspective on the deep, dark part of our planet. The old thinking, and this is what I grew up with even in graduate school, was that the biosphere, the living part of our planet, was restricted to the sunlit surface because everything had to depend on sunlight for primary productivity, right? That's something you learn in basic biology class, except for a few weird examples, like deep sea vents where you had weird stuff, with hydrogen sulfide like spewing out, and there were weird creatures that could live on that and way in the darkness. But even then, we could argue, but wait a minute, remember that marine snow that falls down into the abyss that's really just fish food? Well, the fish eventually had to eat, if you follow the food chain back, it all starts with something photosynthesizing. So even life at the bottom of the dark ocean starts with sunshine up at the surface. But here we have, in deep geological strata, living organisms that have nothing to do with sunlight. They're actually able to run their metabolic systems on a number of different sources, the hydrocarbons themselves that are down there, or hydrogen sulfide, or the radioactive decay that's normally found in geology. So there are all these kind of relic organisms. Geologists call them deep life, and we now believe that by biomass there are more organisms held in the deep geological strata of the Earth than there are here at the Earth's surface, or in all the oceans, which is a phenomenal idea, right? Because our whole mythic structure in the Western, and at least in the West, is that the underworld is abiotic. It's this dark, unliving, rocky place, right? And the living world is at the surface. And so most of the life is actually in the rocks below us. Well, that kind of changes our sense of the underworld. I mean, it means the Earth is literally alive, and that could blow your mind. But for me as a biologist, it means something else. It means, wait a minute, those organisms almost certainly are part of the carbon cycle. And therefore, they may be playing a role in climate stability. And we don't have any idea about that. So here we are laying down a barrage of poisons and blowing up essentially a subterranean coral reef below our feet. We don't have any clue what these organisms are or what role they're playing in the larger stability of the ecosystem. So that is an interesting question to me and a concerning one as a biologist, besides the fact that it blows my mind to think that there's life a mile below our feet, and we've never seen these organisms. They're not connected to us in any way. And what does it mean now that we're opening up these portals between the surface of the Earth and those organisms down there and poisoning them? I cannot think of another ecosystem on which we've laid down a blanket of poison and there hasn't been some blowback to human beings. I mean, that's kind of the lesson of ecology. So it's an incredible experiment that fracking involves. Okay, so I'm going to back up now and say we have 4 forms of extreme fossil fuel extraction, and this is the path we're now blazing. We've kind of run through the easy-to-get stuff. And now we can either decide, wait a minute, there's a law of diminishing returns here, and blaze a trail and pursue a cold warfare with renewables, or we can just keep rolling out these ever more toxic and violent techniques to blast the hard-to-get hydrocarbons out of the ground. So again, we relied on natural gas for a long time. In fact, New York is the first state to ever drill for natural gas. 1821 is when we did it, way over in the Chautauqua County in the western part of our state. But in those days, and up until very recently, most of the gas was held in these big deposits, sort of big bubbles that kind of all these tiny bubbles kind of all combined and were caught underneath some kind of geological substrate. And so all you really need to do is kind of stick a cocktail straw down on the ground, and then up it would come. Now that we've run through those big pockets, what we're left with is blowing up this bedrock of our whole nation, because it's going on very big and try to get all these little bubbles to come out. And that requires tremendous amounts more energy, tremendous amount of these toxic chemicals, poisons, and surfactants, and so forth. And it's going to be happening in the communities where we live. And the trucks bringing all these chemicals are going to be traveling on the same roads that our kids are riding their bicycles on, that school buses are commuting along, that you and I travel back and forth to our jobs on, and so forth. So it becomes this question, is this the path that we really want to go down? And if we don't, then what do we do? Because the biggest industries in the world are rolling this stuff out and claiming it's not our choice, right? Thus, this big lawsuit with Counter Dryden. Your neighbor here stood up and said, no, we don't want it. And we have the right as a community to say no. And the industry said, no, you don't have the right to say. And there was a lawsuit, and right now, Dryden won. Right? It's like the little guy standing in front of the tank in Tiananmen Square. So bravo to Dryden. Yeah, and there are people in this audience. So the heroes of that story are right here, so you should get to know them. All right, so there's two parallel crises, and then there's two parallel scientific arguments about fracking. And both have public health consequences, but they exist in different spheres. So the first argument about fracking is about the greenhouse gas footprint, right? And this is one big argument, especially raised at Cornell, because there's many different opinions on this and different sets of data. And so one thing is clear, and that is that indeed the natural gas, when burned, produces half of carbon dioxide as coal. And carbon dioxide lasts a long time in the atmosphere, about 100 years. And so if you have a hydrocarbon that's cleaner burning, then it's definitely much better. However, the real life question is not what happens when you turn on the flame, coal versus natural gas. The real life question is, let's start the process from blasting both of those things out of the ground with the whole life cycle analysis of it. And when you do that, that's when it gets really murky, because we don't really know how much fugitive methane, and I guess I should say the real chemical name for natural gas is methane. That's what we're talking about, carbon before hydrogen. It's invisible. You know, it has a smell when you turn on your stove, and that's because they add that odor to it so we don't all die of methane poisoning without knowing it. But normally when it comes out of the ground, you can't smell it and you can't see it. So nobody exactly knows when we're mining methane out of the ground how much is leaking. And that's important because even though methane only lasts 20-some years in the atmosphere as opposed to this, century-long lifespan of carbon dioxide, methane is actually almost 30 times more powerful at trapping heat. So it's shorter lived, but it's much more potent. And so we need to know how much methane leaks out to know whether it's really better or worse for the atmosphere than coal. And some people say it's actually worse. Some people say it's actually better. Some people say it's slightly better, but not enough better to roll out a whole new, to industrialize the whole landscape. And so that's where the arguments fly. Now, honestly, I'm going to just go ahead and say Bob Howarth at Cornell, I think, has the best data on this. And he's saying that it's definitely the case that natural gas is no better than coal and maybe worse for the atmosphere than coal. So far, I think he's from what I can see, just based on scientific merit, I think he's got the better argument. But honestly, the whole dispute, to me, lacks grounding in the real world, because we're kind of fighting about how many carbon atoms can dance on the head of a pin here. Because in the real world, the truth is we have no energy plan. We don't. Our nation has no energy plan. So there's no deal to swap out coal for gas. It's very likely that we could frack the whole Marcellus Shale in New York and Pennsylvania and keep blowing up the mountains in Kentucky too. Keep the build the pipeline and keep blasting stuff out of the Gulf of Mexico. I mean, there's nobody making the decision that okay, we'll turn off, we'll stop blowing up the mountains if only you guys agree to frack. So this idea that if you're against fracking then you must be for coal is completely specious argument as far as I'm concerned, because there's no deal. In fact, the plans are already being made because the price of natural gas is so low to export the natural gas that we blast out of our shale here and take it to China or Europe where the price is 7 times higher. So that, so much for energy independence, I guess. Or we can direct the excess gas into the chemical industrial complex and make more PVC floor tiles or more credit cards or something like that to use up the excess. And plans are already being made for that too. So there are different facilities, petrochemical facilities that are planning to go online to try to use up all this excess stuff. And it's not just methane, methane and ethane and other things that kind of come out of the ground with the methane. So in other words, if we don't have an energy policy and have no plan for carbon and no tax on it, the free markets will just have their own way with it. And it's not clear that we're going to swap any one thing for another. So that's why this whole issue of which is better than the other has really little interest to me, actually. So the second real world problem about coal versus gas is that it ignores the damage that's done in extracting and quarrying. Right? So fracking literally turns the earth inside out. It's a real shock and awe operation. And it begins in the sand barrens of Wisconsin, where they're strip mining sand. They can't get it out of the ground fast enough. They're basically just loading up bluffs, hills, coulees into railroad cars and bringing it to Pennsylvania or bringing it to the oil fields in North Dakota and filling the air up with sand dunes of crystalline silica. So we now have haze over rural Wisconsin of a really dangerous kind. This crystalline silica is a low carcinogen. And we've never exposed anybody but sandblasters to a lot of crystalline silica, so we don't even know what the effects will be, let's say, on pregnant women and children and development and so forth. And then we have the problems of what to do with all the wastewater, right? So remember we mentioned it takes 4 to 9 million gallons of water to go down the hole to fracture the shale and force the sand grains into the cracks. Some of that water comes back up, and some of it is entombed down there forever. So from my point of view, fracking is kind of a hostage exchange operation. So you're exchanging life-giving water for death-dealing hydrocarbons. So the hydrocarbons are trapped in the shale. But to get them out, because they're held in the grip of the shale, you have to exchange water. So the water goes in, and the hydrocarbons go out. So the water's gone forever, and now you've got hydrocarbons, which are going to fill up the atmosphere with heat-trapping gas. So to me, it's a really crappy exchange, just to speak bluntly. And so a lot of that water is now permanently trapped in the deep geological shale, and it's now removed from the hydrological cycle forever. Right? But some of it does come back up with the gas. And now it not only has all those toxic chemicals you added in the first place, but also it's radioactive, because it's radioactive down there. It's full of heavy metals, and also there's brine, the original seafloor, the seawater that was down there 500 million years ago. All that salt that's in there all comes back. And there's no technology that we know of to easily turn this back to fresh drinkable water. We could distill it and do all that stuff, but then we'd use up all the energy turning it into vapor and condensing it. So we've ruined it. And so now we have all this ruined water that's really, really, really toxic. And we have to permanently dispose of it somewhere. We're talking about millions and millions of gallons of it that require permanent containment forever. So the solution has been for the Marcellus Shale to ship it to northeastern Ohio and shove it into the ground there. Because they have this sort of geological formation there where they can have what's called deep well injection. We're not able in Pennsylvania or New York to do that here. So the idea is to put it on trucks, all this poisonous stuff, and ship it to northeast Ohio. So that's another kind of problem. That's really not solvable. So I want to talk now about a little bit about child development and fracking, because there are public health injuries at every step of fracking, and they can interfere with the development of children. So let's start with that. We mentioned that there's open pit mining of frac sand, and there's no data at all on what it means for a small child to breathe in crystalline silica. We only have data on sandblasters, adults whose lungs are informed. So let's talk about lungs for a little bit. So lungs are some of the last organs in your body to develop, because you begin as a marine mammal, and you don't really need to be able to use your lungs until the very moment you're born. And so the lungs take kind of a leisurely approach to development. Essentially, they're two vineyards separated by a heart. So if you can imagine these grape-like clusters on the ends of vines, that's kind of what your lungs look like. The grape-like clusters are called alveoli, and that's where the actual gas exchange takes place, where the oxygen in the air leaves the atmosphere and crosses the alveoli and enters your bloodstream. And then the carbon dioxide, which is your waste product left over from all your metabolism, leaves your blood, crosses the alveoli, and then you exhale it. So with every breath, we inhale a pint of atmosphere, and the gas exchange surface is the thinnest place in your body where you meet your environment. Right? So a human hair is about 70 microns in diameter. Your alveoli membranes are about 1 micron. So 1/70th the size of a human hair is the wall between the atmosphere and the inside of your body, inside your chest cavity. And that is a huge surface area. You're taught in biology that your skin is your biggest organ. Actually, it's not the case. If you stretched out your skin it would take up about the size of a double bed bedspread. That's the surface area of your skin. If you stretched out your all the alveoli, all the respiratory surface of your lungs, it takes up the size of a tennis court. So I did the math. It's 25 times bigger than your skin, and so it's huge. But you don't use it in prenatal life, and so it develops right at the last minute, which is why premature babies have such a tough time of it, right? Because they never have as many alveoli as the rest of us. So if you're born more than 3 weeks early, for your whole life, you won't have as many alveoli as somebody who was born full term, and you will always be at risk for respiratory problems. And so when you're a kid, those problems might be asthma. When you're a grown-up, they might be recurrent bronchitis. And then when you're older, you have a higher risk of pulmonary obstructive disorder and emphysema, even as a non-smoker, just because you came into this world with fewer alveoli at the ready. And then something else happens right at the moment of birth, which is that, things that are wet will stick together, like the pages of the book left out in the rain. And so the reason our lungs don't collapse on the exhale at all the walls of the alveoli stuck together is that they're very powerful surfactants, chemicals that are very similar to what actually we use in fracking fluid to make things slippery. And those surfactants flood your lungs right at the moment of birth, so that when you take your first breath after birth, it's like a sky full of parachutes opening up, and they will not collapse again. And so the other problem with premature babies is that they not only do they have fewer alveoli at the ready, but they also don't have any surfactant to keep inflated the alveoli that they do have, which is why we often inject mothers of babies who are going to be born too soon because they've gone into premature labor. We inject them with hormones to speed up the development of the lungs and also provide them with surfactant. But that comes at a price because their lungs will always be smaller than anyone else's. So one of the first things we have to say about fracking is that it always lays down a blanket of air pollution in the community where it occurs because of all the trucks that have to bring all the fracking fluid, all the diesel trucks, because of the incredible diesel generators that provide the power of the 15,000 pounds per square inch, and then the condensers and compressors and everything that has to kind of clean and process the gas when it comes up kind of all runs on diesel. Moreover, a lot of toxic chemicals that are vapors come out of the wellheads, like benzene, formaldehyde, propane, butane, and all these hydrocarbons, which are in general chemists call volatile organic compounds. They will combine with tailpipe exhaust to make smog, ground level ozone.